Hello and welcome to week 2 of technical communication. I am Nikisha Reed and I will be taking you through our topic for this week, which is writing within an organization, focusing specifically on the format and layout of professional correspondence. Now, professional communication in written form requires skill and expertise. From text messages to reports, how you decide to represent yourself with the written word counts. Writing in an online environment requires tact, it requires skill, and it also requires an awareness, that what you write may be there forever. So, from writing memos to writing letters, from writing business proposals to press releases, whatever it is that you're going to be required to write at your workplace, your written business communication represents you and it also represents your company. So, your goal is to make it clear, concise, and professional. Your ability to write good memos, good letters, and emails depends on a clear sense of purpose. It depends on you understanding what your readers' needs are. It depends on your close attention to the formats of these various pieces of writing. So let us convey your message to readers outside of your organization. And memos are an effective way to get things done within your own organization. And emails is a way to communicate quickly with readers, both inside and outside of your organization. So by applying the following guidelines, you can learn how to master the craft of writing effective professional correspondence. Now, you have to know your purpose. Why are you writing this letter? Why are you writing this memo for your colleagues? And why are you writing this email? This is something that is going to set you up to make sure that what you have in the body of the correspondence is actually relevant to your audience. It is a good idea to note your purpose, because you might find that writing it down, that sentence might end up back in the introduction of the piece of writing that you are doing. The second guideline is to make sure that you know who your reader is going to be. Who are you trying to inform or influence? You have to pay particular attention when correspondence will be read by more than one person, for example. So if these readers are from different technical levels or different administrative levels within your organization, the challenge for you increases, because a complex audience means that you will have to reduce the level of technicality in your writing to that which can be understood by all readers. So let us say, for example, you are writing a memo to your colleagues and it is supposed to be addressed to all staff. You do not want to write it using computer jargon that the administrative assistants might not necessarily understand. You want to make sure that because you have a mixed audience, you are writing your memo at a level where everybody in the company, regardless of their technical knowledge, will get the message that you are trying to communicate. It is important to follow the right format when you are putting together your professional correspondence. Most organizations adopt letter and memo formats that must be used uniformly by all employees. Right? So they will have their way of putting it together, but outside of their specific little tweaks, you will find that memos and emails always include a subject line, and depending on the letter that you're writing, you might find a subject line in the letter as well. So when you are writing your subject, give the subject line special attention, because it telegraphs meaning to the audience immediately. In fact, readers use it to decide when or if they will read the complete correspondence. So you want to be brief, but you also want to engage interest. So if attachments or enclosures accompany a letter or a memo, you want to type the singular or the plural form of enclosure or attachment, one or two lines beneath the reference initials as well. because you want to call your readers' attention to the fact that there is an attachment that they need to look out for. Of course, if you're writing an email and there is an attachment, then this is automatically included in the email based on how that is set up. When you are writing, regardless of what you're writing, whether it is a memo, a letter, or an email, ensure that you have an introduction, make sure that you have some body paragraphs, and make sure that you conclude the message that you are trying to send out. If you are delivering a persuasive message, then you can use the 3C's strategy, which is to make sure that you capture interest immediately, make sure that you convince of whatever you want to persuade your audience about by giving them details about the thing that you're trying to get them to buy into, and then promise to get in contact so that you can wrap up the deal at the end of the day. Another guideline that you want to pay attention to, regardless of what you are writing, is to make sure that you stress the you attitude, and you can do that by anticipating questions that your reader might raise and then answer these questions. Another way that you can do that is to replace the personal pronouns I and me with the second person you and your. Of course, you know that you are writing a letter or you're writing an email, so you will definitely have the first person pronoun, the I and me, in there. But there are various ways that you can turn some sentences around so that the focus is on the reader and not necessarily on yourself. And you'll find that you will capture their attention better that way, depending on what your subject matter is. You can give more detail in attachments. So let us say, for example, there is something that you want, there is a report, for example, that you want your audience or your reader to pay attention to. Of course, you're not going to be including the report in the body of the email or the letter or the memo. Well, depending on whether or not it's an informal report, that could take on memo form. But generally, you'll find that you are either writing a covering email or a covering letter that is attached to something like a report or any other lengthy document that you might want your reader to pay attention to. So you can put your details in the attachment, and as I said before, make sure that you call your reader's attention to the fact that you have attached a document that you want them to pay attention to. You have to make sure that in your professional correspondence that you are diplomatic. Without a tactful tone, all of the planning and the drafting that you've done would have been wasted. So you have to make sure that you choose your words carefully. Make sure that you choose words that attempt to persuade or cajole the audience if that is what you're doing, or you give information in an objective way. Do not make any demands. Be especially careful when you're writing memos to people who are probably your subordinate, because if you end up sounding too authoritarian, then your message may be ignored. So even if it is clear that what you're suggesting might help them, just the tone of your correspondence might turn them off and they might not bother to read anything that you have written. Generally speaking, negative letters, or what we call bad news letters, often use the passive voice, and positive letters or good news letters often use the active voice. And there are some examples that I'm going to show you later on in the presentation. So make sure that you also respond quickly. So a letter, a memo, or an email that comes too late fails in its purpose, no matter how well written they might be. So if you are sending out a letter, make sure that you mail the letters within 48 hours of your contact with or request from your reader, depending on what you are doing. If you are sending a memo, make sure that you send the memos in plenty of time for your reader to make the appropriate adjustments in their schedule or in their behavior or whatever it is that you want them to make an adjustment to. And when it comes to emails, it is usually good practice to respond to emails within the 24 hours that you have received it, even if it is just to say that you have received the email and you will give a more complete response later on. Now, some general strategies for writing effective business correspondence. Keep in mind that professional correspondence, regardless of what you are writing, they generally tend to have the same 5 main areas. So there is usually a heading, and of course the formatting of the heading will be different depending on what you are writing, but the heading usually contains the name of the recipient, might often include the address and the date. There is an introduction which establishes your purpose for writing. Then there is a body which should articulate the message itself, so you're giving more details or more information in the body of your correspondence. And of course, there should be a conclusion which restates the main point and may include a call to action if one is required. And then of course, you would have a signature line which sometimes include your contact information, so that your reader or your audience can reach out to you should they require further information or have questions or want to buy into what you might be selling. Now, I've said this before, but I want to remind you that business correspondence represents you and your company. So in order to effectively communicate and in order to create a positive image for yourself as well as for your company, you have to remember that when you are writing these things, you should strive to be as clear as possible, as concise as possible, as specific as possible, and as respectful as possible. You also need to remember that each word that you are choosing should contribute to establishing the purpose of your writing. Each paragraph should focus on one idea. You don't want to be all over the place. You don't want your reader to feel like you have wasted their time or they don't understand what you're saying. So make sure that you have organized your ideas well. The parts of the letter, of the memo, or the email, when they're taken together, they should form a complete message. So it shouldn't be a situation where I am reading towards the end of your email or your letter or your memo and I'm completely lost as to what this section has to do with what you had introduced me to before. So they all work together. And of course, remember that your writing should be free of errors. So it means that you need to make sure that you go back and check and double check and edit before sending off that correspondence. You want to make sure that you represent yourself well, that you represent your organization well. And so it is always a good idea to make sure that you go back and edit, have a second pair of eyes or a third pair of eyes, look over your correspondence before you send those out. Now, in terms of positive correspondence, which is what we might call informally a good news letter, you want to make sure how the format of that good news letter is a little bit different from the other types of correspondence that you might have. So you will have a positive correspondence, a negative correspondence, and a neutral correspondence. Now, as the names suggest, positive correspondence is when you're giving good news. A negative correspondence is when you might be giving bad news, or you might potentially disappoint your reader. And of course, a neutral correspondence is not necessarily good or bad. You're really just giving some information to your audience. Now, what I want you to keep in mind while we're going through this is to remember that letters are brief messages sent to recipients that are often outside of your organization. So if you are writing a letter then you know that you are writing to somebody who is not your colleague, right? So when you're writing a memo, you're usually writing to your colleague. It is an internal document. You're not going to be sending a memorandum to somebody who is outside of your organization. So you send letters outside, you post memos inside internally for the members of your organization. And of course, emails can be either internal or external, but we'll talk about that a little bit more. Generally, we're still looking at the format for positive correspondence. So whether you are writing a letter, a memo, or an email, you'll find that this format in terms of how you organize the information remains the same. So for a good news piece of correspondence, you want to immediately state the good news, right? So immediately you want your reader to see that they are getting good news, and that will convince them to continue to read the rest of the correspondence to see what the details are. So in the body, you would provide supporting information, making sure to clarify any questions that the reader might have about the piece of news that you've given them, and conclude by stating your eagerness to work together or continue a relationship or whatever it is. And if it is appropriate, make sure that you provide a clear statement on what your next steps would be, depending, of course, on what your news was. So these are two examples of the positive correspondence. One is a college acceptance letter and the other is a memo. So you will see in the college acceptance letter that the very first sentence in the letter is stating the good news. I'm pleased to inform you that you've been admitted to whatever degree program. So before anything else, the good news is stated. Same thing happens in the example of the memo that I have here. In the very first sentence, for the third consecutive year, the proceeds from our haunted house project have exceeded our goal. This year's goal is so and so and so. So, and you look at the subject matter for the memo, you'll realize that this letter, the college acceptance letter, does not have a subject line. I mentioned before that not all letters require a subject line, but you will realize that emails and memos require the subject line. So when you look at the subject line for this memo example that I have here, you will see that it says successful Halloween fundraiser. So immediately the reader knows what they're going to be told about. So they know that if they read further, they're going to be given details about how successful the Halloween fundraiser was, but they're not under any illusions about whether or not it was successful just by looking at the subject line. Now, in terms of formatting for bad news or negative correspondence, you're going to do this a little bit differently. All right, so I had said to you a couple slides ago that you use active voice when you are relaying good news, and you use passive voice when you are relaying bad news. So you'll see that that kind of comes out in this all-purpose format for the negative correspondence, because your primary aim when you are sending bad news out is to make sure that you buffer the bad news. You want to make sure that you are clear about what the message is, but it doesn't mean that you have to be cruel about it. So you want to buffer the bad news. So you want to provide a general statement of appreciation in the introduction. In your introduction, you want to say thank you for something, or tell the person that you appreciate something that they've done. That's of course relevant to the subject that you are discussing, but you want to give a general statement of appreciation in the introduction. And then when you get to the body, you want to still emphasize the positive areas, but then somewhere in the body you need to also clearly state the negative areas, and giving your reasons for why it is a negative area, and make sure that you support it with information so that the person is clear about why this decision has been taken, if it's a bad news decision. So, for example, let us say somebody applied to work with your company and you're telling them you're turning them down for the job, then it means that you would give some information about why they were turned down somewhere in the body, right? And then, of course, you want to conclude by expressing interest in a continued relationship, and if possible, state what might happen next. So that if we use the same example of turning somebody down for a job that they had applied for, you could express interest in a continued relationship, maybe by saying something like, there are other jobs that are going to be posted and you're encouraging them to apply again, something like that. Of course, in a letter like that, you might not necessarily have a next step process, but depending again on what the subject matter is, let us say, for example, you're saying to somebody in this bad news letter, you're saying to somebody that, okay, the project has been delayed. It means that in something like that, you're probably going to have a next step. So you might want to say to them that it's been delayed by 5 weeks. These are the reasons. And then in the conclusion, you might want to say, depending on if you have that information, what will happen in the time that that the project is delayed. I have an example of a memorandum here that is asking for a change in the operating hours. So, of course, this is an example of a quote unquote bad news correspondence. You will see in the subject line, it's very clear that there's a change in operating hours. Usually employees didn't have to work on the Friday, but they have gone back on that and they're now required to come in and work. So you'll realize it is set up in much the same way that I explained in the all-purpose format. So there is a little bit of a positive information at the beginning, and then the reasons are listed in the second paragraph, so that you can, in that second paragraph, it mentally prepares the employees for what is about to come. The third paragraph is where you have the bad news stated that the Friday afternoon hours have to be reinstituted. So you'll realize that there's a lot of things that they would have to go through in order to buffer the bad news that, okay, you guys need to start coming back to work on a Friday. And then, of course, it ends with action information and a forward-looking statement. So this is one example of how you could deliver bad news without hurting your readers' feelings. Now, in terms of the all-purpose format for a neutral correspondence, you want to make sure that in your introduction you state precisely what the purpose is for writing. You want to get to the point. In the body, you want to provide details that support the purpose that you've stated. And then, of course, in the conclusion, you want to end by stating your appreciation and, of course, what should come next, if it is appropriate for you to talk about next steps or action steps. And yes, I have another example of what a neutral correspondence looks like. For this memorandum, they're really just asking people to nominate colleagues for the Customer Service Excellence Award. So you'll realize that in the very first sentence, it gets to the point: submit your nominations. This is the purpose of writing. I am writing you to get you to vote. And then details are given in the body of it to show how the nominations are done and to give information about who would qualify. And then, of course, it ends with information, with action information that includes a deadline and all of those things. So that gives you an idea of how you would format positive correspondence, negative correspondence, and neutral correspondence. And of course, these are termed all-purpose because you would do the same thing regardless of if you're writing an email, a memo, or a letter. For the positive correspondence, you want to make sure that you immediately give the good news, then you give some detail, and then you close. For the negative correspondence, you want to make sure that you buffer the bad news. So you start with something positive, make sure that you mentally prepare your reader, clearly state the bad news, and then you talk about, and then you close. And then for the neutral correspondence, you want to immediately get to the point. This is the purpose of me writing. Give some details in the body, and of course, you would close in a courteous way. So we're going to pay some more attention to the individual pieces of correspondence. So, as I said earlier, letters are sent to recipients outside of your organization. You usually find that they're printed on letterhead paper, and they represent the business or the organization in 1 or 2 pages. They're usually short. So even though you'll find that email and text messages might be used more frequently depending on where you work, the effective business letter still remains a common form of written communication that's used by organizations. So it can serve to introduce you to a potential employer if you're looking for a job and you're writing that cover letter, or it could serve to announce a product or a service. So let us say, for example, you're trying to get buy-in from some stakeholders about something that you're putting on the market. A business letter could potentially be used in that situation. Or it may even serve to communicate feelings or emotions. So again, business letters can be positive, they can be negative, or they can be neutral. As I said before, they're primarily used to either provide information or request information. You can use letters to start a conversation, or you can continue a conversation that's already been started, or you can use it to discuss prior negotiations, which is a form of continuing the conversation. You want to make sure that you meet the expectations regarding language for your organization. As I said earlier in the presentation, letters are expected to be concise and clear. You want to make sure, because you're writing a professional letter, that your tone is formal and that you are being professional. Now, in terms of the layout of the letter, depending on what your organization expects, you might be writing a letter using either the block format or the modified block format. But of course, regardless of which one you're using, you will find that your letter should always be single spaced, and you should be using a font that is easy to read. Make sure that you leave a blank line between the paragraphs so that it is easy for your readers to follow the progression of your writing. So on the right, you will see an example of the formatting that's here. You'll realize that there is at the top, it's asking for your address, your name, etc., etc. If this letter is coming from your organization, you'll usually find that information in the letterhead. So depending on what you are writing, you might have it on letterhead paper, or if not, then your address is there. You'll see that there is a subject line here at number 3 where it says where to what this letter refers. That is where you would put your subject if it is that you're writing a letter with a subject line. Then of course you would have the recipient's name and address, and you would have the salutation, the introduction, body, and the closing. And then after that, that is where you would put your signature box there that might usually have some contact information there. Now, a memorandum, or a memo as we like to call it, this is normally used for communicating policies or procedures or relating the official businesses within an organization. So as I said before, it is usually an internal document. It is often written from a one-to-all perspective, so it's broadcasting a message to an audience rather than one-to-one interpersonal communication. It may also be used to update a team on activities for a given project, or you can use it to inform a specific group within a company of an event, action, or observance. Generally, the purpose of the memo is to inform, but occasionally, depending on what you want to do, you can include some elements of persuasion or a call to action. Memos often represent the business or the organization's interests, of course. In terms of the format of the memo, if you look at the example that I have on this slide, the memo usually has a header that clearly indicates who sent it and who the intended recipients are. So when you are writing the memo, you have to make sure that you pay particular attention to the title of the individuals in this section. Make sure that your date and subject lines are also present, and make sure that that is followed by a message that contains a declaration, a discussion, and a summary. So same thing to introduction, body, and a summary. So the to, from, date, and subject field could be in the order that your specific organization specifies. You usually find the subject is the last thing to be listed, but for some memos you might see the date being the first thing. For other memos, such as the one that I have showing here, you have the to field as the first thing. So it really just depends on the preference of your organization. But what you'll find is that regardless of what little tweak they do with that, once you're writing a memo, you'll find that those 4 fields are there. So you have to make sure that you list the date that the memo is to be distributed. Make sure that in the to field, the names of the recipients are listed in the memo. If it is a situation where you are addressing the memo to all of your employees in the company or to a particular department, and you might find that you can't list 50 names or 100 names depending on the size of your organization, then it is okay if you list by group name, such as to all employees or to HR personnel, or whatever it is. In the from field, make sure that you're listing the name and the job title of the people who've authored the memo. So who is this coming from, right? So it's coming from John Brown, who is the HR manager, right? In the subject line, we talked about this before. You have to make sure that you are specific. Think about it like the title of your memo, kind of. So it should give your readers immediately a picture of what is about to be discussed. Now, the headings may be double or single spaced. In the example that I have here, you'll realize that the heading is single spaced, but it could also be double spaced. But what you'll find is that the memo itself is always single spaced, similar to the letter. The letter is single spaced as well. And of course, similar to the letter, the body uses the block format, and you will have a single line spacing in between the paragraphs, similar to what is being shown here on my example. Now, as it pertains to email or electronic mail, as with all other writing, you have to pay attention to the specific writing context. And for some of you, it may surprise you that even elements of form can indicate a writer's strong understanding of the audience and of the purpose. So the principles that I am going to go through here as it pertains to email also apply to the educational context. And so, even though we have an emphasis on what happens in the business place, particularly as it relates to emails, you can use these to communicate with your lecturers and your peers as well. A lot of us tend to forget that we are in a professional setting at the university and we are in a formal setting, and we tend to send some atrocious emails. But hopefully, by the end of this presentation, that will be fixed so that we can know the difference when we are addressing our audience, that if we are talking to our friends, then these rules might not necessarily apply. But in the professional setting, when we are talking to colleagues, when we're talking to lecturers, when we're talking to our heads of department, etc., then we have to make sure that we follow the professional communication guidelines that are about to be given. So make sure that you open with a proper salutation. So using a proper salutation will demonstrate respect for your audience, and of course it serves the secondary purpose of avoiding mix-ups in the case that your message is accidentally sent to the wrong recipient. Right? So if you wanted to send something to Mrs. Henry, but it inadvertently, if you wanted to send something to Beverly Henry, but it inadvertently got to Candice Henry, then just by saying, dear Beverly Henry, then Candice will know that she got it in error, and that error could be brought to your attention. Make sure that you include a clear, brief, and specific subject line. We've talked about this before. And again, I'm going to remind you that making sure that your subject line is clear, making sure it's brief, and making sure it's specific will again help your audience or your recipient to understand the essence of your message. Make sure that you close your emails with a signature. You have to identify yourself by creating a signature block, and that signature block will automatically contain your name and your business contact information. In terms of your roles as student, of course, that will be your name, maybe what you are studying, your USI, things like that. But when you go off into the professional world, your name, maybe your title, where you work, your professional contact information could be included in that signature block. When you're writing emails, business emails, you want to also avoid abbreviation. Keep in mind that an email is not a text message. So you want to make sure that you don't have the same abbreviations that you might be using with your friends in a professional email. It's good practice to make sure that you omit unnecessary words and you're brief in your emails. It takes more out of the reader to read from a screen than it takes for them to read actual paper that they can touch. And so you have to be mindful of that when you are writing emails. It is harder for your reader to get through blocks of information, so you want to make sure that you are not including any unnecessary information and you are as brief as possible. Make sure that you use good format when writing your emails. So try to, again, for the same reason that I just outlined, divide your message into brief paragraphs for ease of reading. A good email should really get to the point quickly, but it should also have a good relationship between text and white space and graphics, so that it is easy for your reader to get through blocks of information. Make sure that you reread, revise, and review so that you can catch and correct spelling and grammar mistakes before you press send, because of course an email is instant, so it will take more time and effort to try to undo the problems caused by being hasty than it would to get it right the first time. So as I said previously, make sure that you sit and think about what your message is, think about what your purpose is, think about who your audience is, make sure that you revise, make sure that you edit to make sure that you get your subject right, your message right. If it is possible, make sure that you give it a second pair of eyes, or a third, if that's possible, to make sure that you are really sending out what you intend to send out. So the final thing in terms of emails, and this is really just for etiquette purposes, use the reply all button sparingly. You do not want to send a reply to everybody who received the initial email unless they should really be getting your reply. Right? So make sure that when you are responding to an email, so let us say, for example, somebody sent out an attachment that is relevant to your department, and you want to say that you have received that email, you do not need to click reply all to say it has been received. You need to reply to the person who sent it only, so that you don't clog up other people's inbox just by you saying that the document was received. So just to summarize, despite the differences in formatting, similar to other types of writing, we might expect to see an introduction, a body, and a conclusion in our professional correspondence. All these are present in letters, in memos, and in emails, and of course, each part has a clear purpose. The introduction announces the main topic. The body elaborates or lists major points associated with that topic, and the conclusion serves as a summary for what we had talked about. Thank you so much for going through this presentation with me. I just want to point out that the information in this presentation was largely taken from one of our prescribed texts, which is the Technical Communication Fundamentals by Fife and Adkins. That book was sent to you by our coordinator, Mr. Mark McGowan. So you should be able to see that in an email, or it might be posted by your lecturer to Moodle, so you can check. But this, the information here was taken largely from chapter 4 of that book. I look forward to seeing you in the webinar, where you can come with all of your questions so that we can dissect this topic a little bit further.